Tokyo, September 1945. The city was quiet in a way it had never been before. No air raid sirens, no shouting, only the wind moving through a sea of ruins. The smell of ash still clung to everything. In the streets, barefoot children wandered among the rubble, searching for anything that could be eaten: a burnt grain of rice, a wilted radish, the skin of a potato. Down the road, a column of American trucks rolled to a stop. The soldiers climbed down slowly, weapons slung but not raised. One of them, a young corporal from Kansas, reached into his rations pack and pulled out a bar of chocolate, melted, bent, wrapped in silver foil. He knelt in front of a small boy, watching from behind his mother's legs. The boy didn't move. He had been told the Americans were monsters, that they ate children and burned cities for sport. But the soldier smiled, broke the chocolate in half, and held it out with an open hand. The boy's mother began to cry, not from fear, but from something deeper. For the first time in years, her child was being offered food, not taken from it. That tiny piece of candy melted faster than anyone expected. It tasted like peace. Japan, in the final months of 1945, was a country that had forgotten what comfort felt like. The war had stripped everything: food, shelter, dignity. Bombing raids had reduced entire cities to skeletal ruins. Tokyo, once home to more than 6 million people, was now a charred maze of rubble and ash. In the countryside, families foraged for roots and weeds. Children scavenged bomb craters for metal they could sell, or for scraps of burned food that might still be edible. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, millions listened in stunned silence. The voice that had once commanded divine obedience now trembled with defeat. For the first time, civilians heard him as human, and that realization broke something inside the nation. Surrender didn't bring instant relief. It brought fear. The people waited for revenge. They expected the Americans to arrive like conquerors, to punish, humiliate, destroy what was left. Propaganda had painted them as monsters with fangs, devourers of women and children. Many mothers hid their daughters when the occupation began, preparing for the worst. "If they come," one woman in Osaka said, "we'll drink poison before they touch us." But when the Americans came ashore, they brought food instead of fury. Under General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, the occupation forces were ordered to restore, not ruin. The Japanese were starving. Rationing had collapsed. In the first weeks after surrender, MacArthur authorized mass shipments of wheat, milk powder, and medicine. Troops were instructed to treat civilians respectfully, to avoid violence, and to display discipline. The war that had ended in fire would now, somehow, begin again with kindness. Still, fear ran deep. When the first American trucks entered Tokyo, people watched from doorways, silent, unmoving. Soldiers distributed canned goods, biscuits, and soap, but few dared approach. Then something unexpected happened, something too small for any military plan to predict. A soldier offered a piece of candy to a child. It wasn't part of any official order. It was instinct, a simple human reflex. A tired young man from Iowa or Kansas, far from home, seeing a starving child and doing the only thing that made sense. He unwrapped a chocolate bar or a stick of gum, rations from his own pocket, and held it out. The child, hesitant at first, reached forward. What followed became one of the most quietly powerful images of the post-war world. Mothers began to weep openly. Children laughed through hunger. And the soldiers, hardened men who had seen Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, stood frozen, realizing they were watching an entire people remember what mercy looked like. Word spread through Tokyo and beyond. "The Americans give candy to the children," people whispered. It seemed impossible, almost mythical. Within weeks, scenes like it began appearing everywhere, from Okinawa's orphanages to the burned neighborhoods of Yokohama. U.S. soldiers, between guard duties and rebuilding missions, offered chocolate, chewing gum, and hard candy to children wherever they went. What began as random acts of compassion grew into something larger. The U.S. Army's Relief and Welfare Division soon supported food distribution for civilians. GIs shared from their rations, sometimes getting reprimanded for giving away too much. But they didn't stop. "It was the only way we could look them in the eyes," one corporal said later. "You can't give a starving kid a sermon. You give him something sweet." For the Japanese, the gesture carried a weight far beyond sugar. After years of indoctrination and terror, that piece of candy was the first proof that the enemy was not what they had been told. It was edible, harmless, even joyful. In its smallness, it healed something no treaty could. In those early weeks of peace, the soldiers and the starving learned to share the same word, arigato, and from that word, trust began to grow, one sweet at a time. The surrender had left Japan not only in ruins, but in moral collapse. Every system that once sustained the country, its economy, its government, its sense of destiny, had disintegrated. Famine threatened millions. The rice harvest of 1945 had failed disastrously, and with the transport system shattered, food from the countryside could no longer reach the cities. Hunger turned people into wanderers. Children with bellies swollen from malnutrition searched garbage heaps for orange peels or bones. Mothers boiled weeds for soup. In some towns, people traded family heirlooms for a handful of barley. The arrival of American troops was at first an unbearable humiliation. To the Japanese people, they were walking symbols of defeat. Yet the GIs who stepped ashore on those blackened islands looked nothing like the monsters from wartime propaganda. They were young, often smiling, carrying cameras instead of whips, their uniforms still dusty from battle, but their eyes oddly gentle. They didn't sneer or shout. They waved. At first, no one waved back. In Tokyo, where hundreds of thousands were homeless, entire families lived beneath tarps, stitched from bombed-out curtains. When U.S. supply trucks rolled through the city, crowds gathered silently along the roadsides. Soldiers threw out ration cans and loaves of bread, but many Japanese refused to touch them. They feared poison or humiliation. It took the children to bridge the gap. In late September, a group of American engineers rebuilding a bridge near Ueno Station noticed two small boys watching them from the rubble. One of the soldiers, Private First Class William Sanders, offered them a stick of chewing gum. The boys hesitated. When Sanders broke it in half and put one piece in his mouth to show it was safe, they giggled and stepped forward. One piece became 2, then 10. By the next day, a dozen children appeared, hands outstretched, calling shyly, "Gomu! Gomu!" The word spread faster than any military order. Across the shattered country, children began to appear wherever Americans gathered, whispering requests for gum or chocorito. To the soldiers, it was harmless generosity. To the civilians, it was a miracle, a symbol of life returning to a place that had forgotten sweetness. Japanese newspapers soon began to report these encounters. A Kyoto editor, risking censure, wrote in October 1945, "The conquerors walk among us without hatred. They give candy to our children. This is not the war we were promised." For many Japanese parents, those small acts triggered overwhelming emotion. The same soldiers whose bombs had once destroyed their homes were now feeding their children with their own hands. It was too much to process. Mothers bowed so deeply that their foreheads touched the dirt. Some wept openly. The shame of defeat clashed violently with gratitude, and the only thing left was tears. General MacArthur noticed it too. In a report to Washington, he wrote, "The conduct of American troops among the Japanese populace has been exemplary. The Japanese people, once fearful, now respond to kindness with reverence." MacArthur's headquarters soon began formalizing relief efforts. Ration dumps were established. Local governments were allowed to distribute surplus military food. American troops were told to respect Japanese customs, to smile, to avoid shouting orders. MacArthur's message was clear. The war had ended, and the peace had to be won with humanity, not humiliation. Still, for many GIs, the kindness wasn't policy. It was personal. They had seen too much death to stomach more cruelty. Many of them had fought on Okinawa or in the Philippines. They knew what hatred did to men. "We were tired of killing," one Marine later said. "Giving candy felt like medicine for the soul." To the Japanese, those moments felt surreal. A generation raised to worship the emperor now saw their supposed enemies kneeling to speak with children, laughing, offering sugar where once there had been gunfire. The effect was electric. Children who had cowered in bomb shelters began waving at passing trucks. Civilians started greeting patrols with shy smiles and quiet good mornings. A few historians later called it the Chocolate Revolution. It wasn't organized or recorded, but it changed everything. The first taste of American candy became the first taste of peace. In a society stripped of joy, sweetness returned as something holy. One teacher from Hiroshima recalled, "After the occupation began, one of my students brought a piece of chewing gum to class. He shared it with 7 others. None of them had tasted sugar in years. They all cried as they chewed." It was the taste of safety. Those moments laid the foundation for Japan's recovery more than any speech or treaty ever could. The people began to see the occupiers not as destroyers, but as protectors. And the soldiers, in turn, began to see the people they had once bombed as human again. In the ruins of empire, both sides were learning the same truth, that mercy rebuilds faster than hatred ever could. Hunger does strange things to people. It humbles the proud, erases the boundaries between guilt and innocence. By the time the occupation began, Japan's cities had been starved not only of food, but of hope. Parents sold furniture for rice, traded wedding rings for soybeans, boiled bark, and grass for soup. Children stopped crying when hungry. They simply stared, hollow-eyed, at the ground. To those who had lived through the war, the appearance of American soldiers was a nightmare come to life. Every mother had heard the rumors. Americans were brutal, merciless. They would take revenge for Pearl Harbor and the Bataan Death March. When the first olive drab trucks arrived, many women hid their children, whispering, "Don't look at them, don't speak." But then the soldiers began giving things away. Not orders, not punishment, food, bread, canned peaches, milk powder, and sometimes, if they were lucky, chocolate. That single act defied everything the Japanese had been taught. In a culture built on hierarchy and discipline, to receive compassion from the enemy was overwhelming. The shame of defeat met the relief of survival in a collision too powerful to contain. Some civilians bowed until their foreheads bled. Others simply wept, unable to reconcile kindness with ruin. One mother later told an interpreter, "When my son took the chocolate, I wanted to pull him back. I feared a trick. But then the soldier smiled, and I knew. We were safe." To the Americans, the reaction was bewildering. "They cried like we'd given them gold," one Marine recalled. "All I had was a Hershey bar." Yet what he didn't realize was that he had given them something far rarer, proof that mercy could exist after war. 2. The psychological angle. The undoing of fear. Fear was the first language of post-war Japan. For 15 years, the government had fed its citizens a steady diet of propaganda, warning that surrender would mean annihilation. The phrase, "the White Devils," was repeated endlessly in schools and newspapers. Children were told to kill themselves rather than fall into enemy hands. When those white devils began handing out candy instead of bullets, it shattered an entire worldview. Psychologists studying the early occupation called it collective cognitive collapse. The Japanese mind, conditioned for absolute obedience and fear, suddenly had to reconcile two truths. The enemy had destroyed their cities, but also saved their children. In this contradiction, something transformative began. The people's instinctive terror gave way to confusion, then curiosity, then gratitude. Civilians who once avoided American patrols began approaching them. Mothers brought their children forward, bowing, whispering arigato with trembling voices. Soldiers, unused to reverence, stood awkwardly, unsure how to respond. The change was mutual. For years, American troops had been taught to see the Japanese as faceless enemies, fanatics who fought to the death, who bombed Pearl Harbor and executed prisoners. Yet when they met the survivors, frail, starving, grateful, it broke through their own armor of hatred. "I stopped hating the day I handed a piece of candy to a little girl," said one GI. "She smiled with half her teeth missing, and I thought, she's just a kid. We killed her world, and she still smiled." The candy, in that sense, was not merely food, it was therapy, for both sides. When peace came, it demanded a different kind of courage. The Americans had fought through fire and blood, seen friends die on beaches and in jungles. Now they were being asked to forgive, to rebuild the land they had burned. For many, it was harder than combat. Yet compassion became the unspoken mission of the occupation. Soldiers who once carried rifles now carried rice sacks. Engineers built roads instead of destroying them. Corpsmen tended to malnourished children who clung to their arms like vines. "We were still soldiers," one officer wrote, "but now we fought against hunger, not men." Handing out candy was never part of the official policy, but it became its truest expression. It was an instinctive rebellion against hatred, a small act that said, "The war is over. We are human again." For the Japanese civilians, accepting that kindness required equal bravery. Pride had been beaten into them as deeply as fear. Many felt unworthy of help from the very people their leaders had sworn to destroy. When American soldiers offered food, they bowed too low, apologized too much, often returning later to give gifts in return: origami cranes, hand-sewn cloth, small painted stones. "We wanted them to know we were people too," said one survivor from Yokohama. In those exchanges, both sides shed something heavy. The Americans let go of vengeance. The Japanese let go of shame. Photographs from 1945 show a scene repeated across Japan. Women kneeling in the dust, heads bowed, children clutching bars of chocolate in their small hands. To Western eyes, it looked like simple gratitude. But to those women, it was something closer to collapse. For years, they had fed their children lies born of necessity. "Father will come home soon. The war will end before winter." They had promised safety they could not deliver. Then, one day, the same enemy whose bombs had taken everything gave their children sugar. The sweetness was unbearable. A woman in Nagoya later told a journalist, "When my daughter ate that candy, she smiled for the first time in months. I cried because I remembered what her smile looked like." To the soldiers, the moment was equally haunting. Some could not eat their own rations afterward. "You give them candy," wrote Corporal Frank Lewis, "and you realize it's the first joy they've had since their city burned. You walk away shaking." For both giver and receiver, the act carried the weight of a prayer. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. In that shared sweetness, both sides tasted what peace could be. Fragile, uncertain, but real. In a country stripped of speech by censorship and defeat, candy became a new kind of communication. It needed no translation, no interpreter. It was a universal symbol of innocence, a reminder that the world had once been simple. Children began following U.S. convoys through the streets, calling out the words they had learned. Hello, Candy, Chocorito. Their laughter filled the ruins where silence had ruled. For the first time, Japanese cities echoed not with air raids, but with children's voices. A few American officers worried that the generosity might backfire, that the people would see it as pity. But MacArthur understood its deeper power. If they can trust us with their children, he wrote, they can trust us with their future. And so the chocolate and chewing gum kept flowing. Tiny sugar-wrapped peace treaties handed out one by one from the pockets of men who had come to conquer and instead learned to heal. By the end of 1945, an unspoken alliance had begun, built not from treaties or politics, but from something small enough to fit in a child's hand. Candy became the first taste of America's new promise, that it had come not to destroy Japan, but to teach it how to live again. Before 1945, Japanese culture had been steeped in the language of sacrifice. Children grew up reciting patriotic songs that glorified death for the emperor. Candy, once common in small family shops, had long disappeared under wartime rationing. Sugar was reserved for the military. Civilians hadn't tasted it in years. Sweetness itself became a memory, an indulgence of a world that no longer existed. When American soldiers began handing out candy, they unknowingly reintroduced more than flavor. They revived a forgotten piece of Japan's identity, the idea that joy could be innocent. In a nation drowning in guilt and loss, that was revolutionary. The first bites were hesitant. Many children didn't know how to unwrap foil or chew gum. They thought it was medicine. Some saved pieces of chocolate to show their families, keeping them as treasures instead of eating them. Others shared one stick of gum among 5 friends, passing it between them, savoring it like communion. Local elders, watching from the shadows, struggled to reconcile the image. These foreign men, tall, loud, reeking of tobacco, were supposed to be monsters. Yet here they were, laughing with their children, handing out the very sweetness war had stolen. It confused us, said an old man from Hiroshima. We thought mercy had died, but there it was, in their hands. Candy became a cultural bridge. Children began waving at passing convoys, calling out "Chocorito" and running beside jeeps. In return, soldiers threw candy, gum, sometimes canned fruit. Those moments of laughter, brief, chaotic, innocent, did more for peace than any broadcast from MacArthur's headquarters. Even Japanese teachers, once forbidden to speak English, began teaching children to say "thank you" to the soldiers. One recalled, "We didn't want them to learn English as the language of defeat. We wanted them to learn it as the language of gratitude." By the end of 1946, that change in tone could be felt everywhere. American troops who once faced suspicion were now greeted with smiles. Civilians began opening small shops again. The first candies made by Japanese confectioners after the war, simple sugar drops and caramels, were inspired by the ones American soldiers had shared. In sweetness, an entire culture rediscovered hope. Historians often mark the post-war U.S.-Japan alliance as a product of political strategy, economic aid, and reconstruction. Yet, beneath the grand headlines, it began in much smaller moments. Shared meals, shared laughter, shared kindness. The candy incidents, as they were sometimes called by occupation officials, were recorded in internal reports, not for their sentimental value, but for their strategic importance. The goodwill created by small acts of generosity has proven decisive in calming civilian populations. One U.S. Army memorandum from late 1945 noted, "Children's trust appears to influence the attitudes of their parents." Indeed, it did. Once mothers saw their children returning unharmed and smiling after encounters with American soldiers, fear began to fade. Families started approaching occupation units not with resistance, but with requests for work, supplies, or medicine. Within months, the military established official humanitarian contact points. Soldiers were encouraged to visit schools, bring rations, and talk to teachers. It was the beginning of what sociologists later called the psychological occupation. Instead of dominance, it relied on familiarity. Instead of violence, it relied on sweetness. The gesture of candy even found symbolic form. The U.S. Army Air Forces initiated Operation Little Victuals in 1948 during the Berlin airlift, an echo of what had happened in Japan. Pilots dropped candy parachutes for starving German children, inspired by stories from the Pacific occupation. The act became legend, but few remembered that its roots lay in the ruins of Tokyo, where American soldiers first discovered that compassion could rebuild faster than bombs could destroy. For Japan, those memories became generational. The children who once shouted "Chocorito" grew into adults who would welcome American teachers, filmmakers, and businesses. The United States had proven that victory could coexist with empathy, and that, more than any treaty, won hearts. Decades later, those children remembered the candy as if it were yesterday. In interviews recorded in the 1980s, elderly Japanese men and women spoke of that first taste of chocolate with startling clarity. "I didn't know what it was," said one woman from Osaka. "I thought it would be bitter like medicine, but it melted on my tongue, and I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed since my father died in the war." Another recalled keeping a piece of gum in her pocket for months, smelling it every night before sleep because she couldn't bear to chew it. "It smelled like heaven," she said. "I wanted to remember what kindness felt like." For many, the sweetness became the dividing line between two worlds, the world before peace and the world after. It marked the moment when fear began to loosen its grip, when the enemy became a neighbor, and when children once taught to hate began dreaming of something better. American veterans remembered it too. Some returned to Japan years later, curious about the people they'd once occupied. One soldier, then in his 70s, visited Hiroshima in 1989. He met an elderly woman who thanked him in fluent English. "You gave candy to my brother," she said. "He told me he learned what kindness was that day." The man, stunned, replied softly, "We just wanted you to smile." Both cried. In a war remembered for its cruelty, these small gestures endure because they defied its logic. They proved that after the fire and the fury, compassion could still grow from ashes. The candy didn't just feed children, it restored faith in goodness, in people, in tomorrow. When sweetness returned to Japan, so did innocence. And in that fragile exchange between soldier and child, both nations began to rebuild not just cities, but hearts. It happened in the ruins of a small village outside Yokohama in the early winter of 1945. The air was cold enough that the wind burned the skin, carrying with it the smell of smoke and seawater. The war had been over for months, but its ghost still lingered everywhere: burned wood, collapsed roofs, fields littered with twisted metal. Children scavenged for sticks to make small fires, their thin arms wrapped in scraps of old kimonos. Down the road came a convoy of American trucks, part of a relief unit distributing rations to isolated villages. The soldiers had been warned. "Be cautious. Don't touch anyone. They're afraid of you." But as the first truck slowed near the village square, the driver saw movement, small faces peeking out from behind a broken wall. The soldiers stopped. One man, Sergeant James Whitaker from Michigan, stepped out carrying a box of sea rations. He was 23, lean, with eyes that had seen too much. His boots crunched on frost as he approached the children. A mother appeared from behind the rubble, her kimono patched and threadbare. She bowed low, her shoulders trembling. Whitaker froze. He didn't know how to respond. He'd fought on Okinawa, had seen civilians die in caves rather than surrender. Now this woman was bowing to him, thanking him for simply being alive. He set the box down and reached into his jacket pocket. Inside were 3 Hershey bars, soft from body heat. He knelt and held one out to the nearest child, a boy, maybe 6 years old, barefoot in the cold. The boy didn't move. His mother whispered something in Japanese, urgent, frightened. Whitaker didn't understand, but her tone told him everything. She thought it was a trick. He unwrapped the candy, broke off a small piece, and ate it himself. The boy's eyes widened. Slowly he reached forward, took the other piece, and placed it carefully in his mouth. His eyes fluttered shut. For a moment, he didn't chew, he just let it melt. When he finally swallowed, he made a small sound, half sigh, half laugh. His mother gasped softly. Whitaker smiled. "Good?" he asked. The boy stared, then nodded shyly. From the trucks, other soldiers began stepping down, watching. One laughed, pulled a pack of gum from his pocket, and tossed it gently toward the group. Another followed with hard candies. Within minutes, the square was filled with color. The glint of wrappers in the gray air, children chasing after pieces as they fell. And then something extraordinary happened. The mothers began to cry. Not loud, not hysterical, but the kind of crying that comes when a dam finally breaks. Their shoulders shook, their hands covered their faces, and the soldiers stood helpless, unsure what they had done wrong. Whitaker turned to the interpreter, a young Japanese man named Kenji Tanaka, who had joined the Americans as a volunteer translator. "What's happening?" he asked quietly. Kenji swallowed hard. "They're crying because their children are eating sweets," he said. "They thought they would never taste sugar again. They thought they would die hungry." The words hit Whitaker like a blow. He looked around, the children laughing, their mothers weeping, his fellow soldiers standing silently. He had fought through blood and noise and chaos, but he had never felt anything like this quiet mercy in a place that had once been hell. He pulled another candy bar from his pocket and handed it to a little girl standing nearby. She took it, then, after a long pause, broke it in half and offered one piece back to him. "For you," she said softly, the English awkward but clear. Whitaker froze. Throat tight. He nodded, accepted the gift, and whispered, "Thank you." The men in the convoy didn't know it, but that moment would become one of the first widely reported acts of compassion during the American occupation. A military photographer following the relief unit captured it, the soldier kneeling, the mother crying, the child holding the chocolate. The photograph would later appear in a small American magazine under the headline, "Peace in a Bar of Chocolate." To the Japanese, that image traveled faster than any official decree. For the first time, they saw the enemy not as destroyers, but as men capable of tenderness. The story spread from village to city, whispered through markets and printed in local newspapers. The Americans give candy to our children. In Tokyo, mothers began sending their children to watch the supply trucks, holding them up to wave at the soldiers. Fear melted, slowly, like chocolate on a child's tongue. That night, back at camp, Whitaker wrote in his journal, "Today I handed a piece of chocolate to a boy. His mother cried like I'd given him a kingdom. I think maybe I did." The next morning, as the sun rose over the bay, the soldiers prepared to move on. But before they left, the villagers gathered at the edge of the road. The same mother who had bowed the day before approached again, holding something wrapped in cloth. She presented it to Whitaker, a handful of persimmons, the last from her home. He tried to refuse, but she insisted, pressing them into his hands. "Arigato," she whispered, her voice breaking. For the first time in years, the words, "Thank you, an enemy," lived in the same sentence. The convoy returned to the same village 2 weeks later. This time, they were not greeted by silence. As the trucks rumbled down the dirt road, children began to appear, first 2, then 10, then dozens, running alongside the tires, waving frantically, shouting words the soldiers had never expected to hear from Japanese lips. "Hello, candy, chocorito." Sergeant Whitaker laughed, leaning out the window. He tossed a handful of wrapped sweets toward the crowd. The children squealed as the candies scattered into the air like confetti. Their laughter echoed through the cold morning, bouncing off the ruined houses and frozen fields. It was the first joyful sound that village had made in years. When the truck stopped, the villagers gathered in the square again. But now, instead of fear, there was anticipation. Mothers held babies on their hips, smiling nervously. The soldiers unpacked crates, food, clothing, medicine, and once again, chocolate. Whitaker found the same boy from before, the one who had tasted the first piece. The child grinned shyly, his cheeks fuller now. Whitaker crouched beside him. "Remember me?" he asked. The boy nodded and pointed at his own mouth, laughing. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded paper, carefully drawn in crayon. It was a picture of a man in uniform giving candy to children. Beneath it, in shaky letters, was written, "Thank you, America." The soldier blinked hard and swallowed the lump in his throat. "You kept this?" he whispered. The boy nodded. The mothers gathered close, bowing again. But this time there were no tears of fear, only gratitude. One woman stepped forward, pressing her palms together. "Your food, your candy. They make our children smile again," she said haltingly through the interpreter. "When children smile, mothers forgive." That single line silenced the entire camp. Even the interpreter paused, repeating the words slowly so everyone could understand. When children smile, mothers forgive. Whitaker would later write that no sermon or treaty had ever struck him harder. "That woman ended the war more completely than any general," he said. From that day, the candy ritual became a kind of ceremony. Every Sunday, after supplies were distributed, the soldiers would gather near the trucks and hand out sweets to the children. The Japanese began calling it Ame no Hai, the Day of Candy. Even those with nothing left brought small offerings in return: origami cranes, woven straw dolls, handwritten poems of thanks. The friendship grew quietly but powerfully. One afternoon, Whitaker brought a Polaroid camera and began taking pictures of the children. The mothers gasped at the images, seeing instant photos for the first time, proof that joy could be captured. One child, unable to believe it, kept touching the glossy surface, whispering, "It's like magic." That winter, a snowstorm cut the village off for days. The Americans, fearing starvation among the locals, organized an emergency food drop from nearby Yokohama. As the planes flew overhead, villagers ran into the streets, waving cloths and shouting greetings. When the parachutes opened, crates filled with bread, milk, and yes, candy, floated down like blessings. One crate landed near the village square. Children tore it open and found dozens of small chocolate bars wrapped neatly in wax paper. Inside, a note was written in English and carefully translated by the interpreter. "To the children of Japan, may you never be hungry again. From your friends, the soldiers of the 7th Infantry." That note was pinned to the door of the local schoolhouse, where it remained for years. Teachers told the story to every new class. The Americans gave them candy from the sky. In the months that followed, similar stories unfolded across the country. Soldiers stationed in Tokyo, Okinawa, and Nagasaki began carrying sweets in their pockets. Children learned to wait outside the gates, calling out cheerfully for chocorito. Entire communities began associating American troops not with bombs, but with kindness. Historians later noted that these small gestures were what allowed Japan's reconstruction to begin so smoothly. A people once terrified of their conquerors now trusted them because their children had first. Years later, Whitaker returned home to Michigan. He carried with him a photo from that winter, a group of Japanese children smiling in the snow, candy in hand, an American soldier crouched among them, grinning like a proud older brother. On the back, he had written a single line: "They cried when we gave them candy. We cried when they laughed." He framed it and hung it above his desk. Whenever someone asked him what peace looked like, he pointed to that picture. "It looks like this," he said, "not a flag or a speech, just a handful of kids and a piece of chocolate." Back in Japan, the boy from that photo grew up to be a school teacher. Every year he told his students the same story: how, after the war, a soldier with tired eyes and gentle hands taught him the meaning of peace. And at the end of every school year, he gave each child a piece of chocolate and whispered, "Share it." Because that was how the world had started again. By the summer of 1946, Japan's wounds were beginning to scab over. The fires were out, the rubble was being cleared, and for the first time since surrender, there was laughter in the air. Not much, but enough. Children who had once hidden from American soldiers now waited for them, racing through alleyways with paper bags, calling, "Chocorito! Chocorito!" The occupation had entered a new phase, less military, more human. Rebuilding Japan was no longer about dominance or control. It was about restoring dignity to a people who had lost everything. And the strange truth was that it began not with treaties or speeches, but with chocolate. Word of the candy convoys spread far beyond Yokohama. Stories filtered back to the United States, letters from soldiers describing the faces of starving children lighting up over a single sweet. One headline in a Kansas newspaper read, "Our boys trade chocolate for smiles in Japan." Another wrote simply, "Mercy in uniform." To the American public it was shocking. They had seen propaganda caricatures that painted the Japanese as inhuman. Now they saw their sons and brothers offering compassion to those same people. It softened hearts on both sides of the ocean. In Japan, those small gestures transformed the image of the occupiers. Soldiers who had been viewed with suspicion now became symbols of generosity. Civilians began approaching bases with gifts, origami cranes, letters, even flowers. American units started organizing open days where villagers were invited inside to share tea and rice cakes. Children sang English songs they had learned from soldiers, "You Are My Sunshine," "Home on the Range." The Japanese press began publishing cautious but hopeful editorials. One read, "We feared they would bring vengeance. Instead, they bring bread and sweets. Perhaps mercy is stronger than the sword." For the Americans, the experience was equally transformative. Hardened veterans, men who had once fought through Saipan and Iwo Jima, found themselves sitting cross-legged in bombed-out classrooms, teaching children how to say "thank you" and "friend." The guilt of what they'd seen and done was heavy, but the children's smiles made it bearable. General MacArthur, observing the growing affection between occupiers and civilians, encouraged the policy quietly. "Let them see our humanity," he said. "That will rebuild Japan faster than any blueprint." In one of his later speeches, he reflected on what he had witnessed. The soldier who gives bread to a hungry child does more to end war than any general who commands an army. In villages across the country, the Day of Candy became part of the rhythm of life. On Sundays, when the convoys rolled through, mothers sent their children to greet the trucks, their laughter echoing through streets that had once known only sirens and fire. For a generation that had grown up on air raids and hunger, this was the first time peace had a taste. And it was sweet. Years later, a U.S. relief official wrote, "Those bars of chocolate and sticks of gum may have done more for our mission than 1,000 tons of rice." The mothers who once wept over burned cities now watched their children trade sweets with the soldiers who had come to occupy them. The bitterness of war was slowly dissolving, one piece of candy at a time. And somewhere in that quiet exchange between conqueror and conquered, something far greater was being rebuilt. Not cities, not governments, but trust. By 1947, Japan's recovery had gathered momentum. Cities were rising from ashes, markets were reopening, and schools, once filled with silence, were alive again with laughter and chalk dust. But beneath the statistics of reconstruction lay something less visible and far more enduring: the rebirth of humanity. Everywhere the occupation spread, the same quiet story unfolded. American soldiers kept a small corner of their rations aside, not for themselves, but for the children. They did it instinctively now, without orders, without cameras. The ritual had become personal, almost sacred. When a GI's convoy entered a town, the kids would appear as if from nowhere, running barefoot, waving, shouting, "Candy-san! Candy-san!" The soldiers laughed, tossing sweets into the air like snowflakes. Some of those children would later say it was the first time they felt safe around a man in uniform. Before that, one recalled, uniforms meant bombs. That single shift, fear replaced by trust, was the true victory of the post-war years. The Americans began working closely with local communities, rebuilding schools and playgrounds. Many Japanese teachers encouraged their students to write thank you notes in English. One note from a child in Hiroshima read, "To the soldier who gave me candy, thank you for showing me that enemies can be kind. I want to be kind too." When those letters reached the American base, even hardened men wept. "I didn't think we were capable of kindness anymore," one corporal said. But these kids made us remember who we were before the war. Across Japan, the narrative of the occupation shifted. Instead of conquerors, Americans became teachers, medics, and neighbors. Some soldiers learned Japanese phrases. Some even attended local festivals. They shared baseball games, music, and meals. The smallest gifts, an apple, a toy, a smile, became the building blocks of a relationship that would one day define the Pacific world. Years later, historians would call it soft power, but to the people who lived it, it was simply decency rediscovered. The candy itself became legend. Japanese candy makers, inspired by the generosity of the soldiers, began producing their own sweets again. Confectionery factories reopened across Osaka and Tokyo, creating new brands designed for post-war children, brightly wrapped, inexpensive, filled with sugar and hope. For the first time since the war, stores filled with laughter as children pressed coins onto counters. In one shop near Yokohama, the owner displayed a faded photograph on the wall, a smiling American soldier surrounded by local kids holding chocolate bars. Beneath it, a hand-painted sign read, "He gave us candy. We give sweetness back." That spirit rippled far beyond candy. It reshaped diplomacy, culture, and even memory. The generation of children who had once waited beside dusty roads for the candy convoys grew up to lead Japan's new future. Many became teachers, artists, and business leaders. Some even emigrated to America, carrying with them the story of how compassion, not conquest, rebuilt their nation. In 1975, 30 years after the end of the war, a reunion was organized in Yokohama. Former American soldiers met with the Japanese villagers they had once fed. Among them was a gray-haired man with a soft Midwestern accent, Sergeant James Whitaker. When he stepped off the plane, waiting to greet him, was a Japanese man in his 40s with a folded paper in his hand. It was the same crayon drawing, a soldier giving candy to a child. The man smiled. "My name is Haruto," he said. "You gave me this." Whitaker's eyes filled instantly. He reached out, trembling. "You kept it?" "Yes," Haruto replied, voice breaking. "It reminded me that kindness is real. It made me want to become a teacher." The two men embraced as cameras clicked, but neither posed for them. They were too busy crying. That reunion, unnoticed by most of the world, symbolized something far greater than any treaty ever signed. Two men, once divided by war, stood together, bound by a single memory of sweetness shared in the ruins. Because in the end, it wasn't victory that rebuilt Japan. It was compassion, measured not in speeches or strategies, but in the small, melting gift of a soldier's chocolate bar. History often measures victory by flags and treaties, but the quiet truth of peace is written in smaller gestures, in a smile, in an open hand, in a shared piece of candy. When American soldiers handed chocolate to starving Japanese children, they weren't following an order or enacting policy. They were doing something deeper, instinctive, reclaiming their own humanity after years of war that had stripped it away. Those children, who had been taught to fear them, looked up with cautious wonder and saw not monsters, but men. In that brief exchange, both sides found a new kind of strength. For Japan, the sweetness of chocolate became the taste of rebirth. For America, it became proof that mercy could heal faster than vengeance. The barbed wire of occupation softened into friendship. Streets once littered with rubble began to fill with laughter again. The act was so small, so ordinary, that it almost escaped the record books, but it changed the story of two nations forever. In later years, when those same children became adults, they would tell their own children not about the bombs, but about the candy. They remembered the warmth of strangers who had every reason to hate them and chose instead to be kind. And maybe that's the real legacy of that moment, not a victory of arms, but of conscience. It proved that peace is not built in grand speeches or marble halls. It begins in the simplest of acts, a soldier kneeling in the dirt, offering sweetness to a starving child, and realizing that compassion is the truest form of power. Because in the end, wars end not when the guns go silent, but when the human heart remembers how to be gentle. And on that cold morning in 1945, amid the ruins of Yokohama, a single piece of chocolate melted, not just on a child's tongue, but into the memory of a world learning, at last, how to be kind again.